I think I then left to myself a little bit of the task of looking forward a little bit, right, and saying, given the past 25 years, given where we are, what might it look like to sort of envision a little bit where we could be? In some respects, the answer to that question is just to continue to faithfully do what we have been doing. And that certainly, I think, is part of the picture. I titled the talk, Christian Study Centers and the Future of Christian Learning. So I want to say just briefly, because I don't know that I'll develop this too much later on, but I do want to say briefly, I chose learning rather than education deliberately. And so part of the reason for that is that education, I think, to our minds, to our ears, gets narrowed into whatever the sort of university, higher ed version of the magic kingdom that Jay talked about yesterday, right? So we'll get back to that. The other reason for that is that I've read too much of Von Illich. So I want to think about not just when we think about education, like what happens in a for-credit, degree-granting institution, but simply where does Christian learning happen? And what role do study centers have to play in that picture? But also, I will be talking a little bit about Christian higher ed. So there are two questions that might orient us at the beginning. In a few minutes, I'm going to, after the first part of what I want to share with you, I'm going to reframe those questions a little bit or just tweak them, and then they'll lead us into the last part. Okay, so the two questions that I'll just put before you. How do study centers fit into the landscape of Christian higher education? How do study centers fit into the landscape of Christian higher education? Jay and Richard can both correct me. I'm not sure this is the way we've ordinarily thought about the study center. We certainly think of the study center in relation to the university, right? In this case, UF. But how do we think about what we are in connection to what other Christian institutions of higher ed, Christian colleges, universities are doing? And is there something fruitful about considering that as we think about the future? Okay, so that's the first question. And then the second question is, I think maybe a question we're more used to asking, which is how do study centers contribute to the life of the universities that they serve? And I am obviously focused on our center. It's the center for which I can speak. But I want to continuously remind us throughout this talk that we are one of many at this point. And so the UVA Study Center is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and in many respects did pioneer this form of the study center model. And we're now celebrating 25. Chesterton House is also at Cornell University celebrating this year its 25th anniversary. And I believe it was in 2008, Richard, you can maybe correct me on this, but there were 9 member centers at the first meeting of the Consortium of Study Centers, roughly, at the most, okay? And that was in 2008, if I have done my homework, okay? There are 30 some odd centers currently, right? So I think it's encouraging, to me that's very encouraging, that the work that is happening here, in different ways, and not exactly in the way that we do it, but this kind of work is happening not just here in Gainesville, not just in Charlottesville, but at nearly 40 institutions across the country. And to the credit of Carl Johnson, who is the director at Cornell, Chesterton House in Cornell, who is now the director of the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, I think his desire is to see 100 study centers within the decade. And I think that's important. And that's important to contextualize what we're doing. It's an important part of how I'm thinking about the answers to these two questions that I proposed to you today. Okay? All right, so I want to lay out, if we're going to ask this question, I'm going to ask this question and tell you what I think about it, about how study centers fit into the landscape of higher education and then the university. We need to understand a little bit about what that context, what it looks like now, right? And as you know, or maybe you don't know, but I think as you probably know, there is a lot of, I was going to say ink being spilled, but pixels being clicked, I don't know, about the state of higher education, both Christian and non-Christian. Right? UF is an interesting little case study in that particular sort of segment of the discourse, right? So I'm not going to address all the possible things that we could say about the state of Christian education, the state of UF present, right? But I do want to highlight a few things that, again, maybe you've picked up along the way. So I want to talk a little bit about attitudes, the changing attitudes toward higher education in general. Talk a little bit about demographics. This is not my usual deal, so bear with me. And then I will talk a little bit about the technological context. Yes, my deal, but don't worry. I will spend only the briefest time on that. And then that'll help us sort of get a sense for the landscape, right? Elements of the landscape that I think are important for us to consider, okay? So, definitely not my speed. I'm going to just read some statistics to you, okay? But you're going to bear with me, and here we go, okay? So, according to a 2025 Pew Research study, only 22% of American adults say that the cost of getting a 4-year college degree today is worth it, even if someone has to take out loans. So you'll see that in the framing of this question, the loans is a big part of that, as it should be. Right? So if you have to take out loans, only 22% of American adults, according to this survey in 2025, will say, hey, that college degree, that's worth it. Right? That strikes me as a fairly low number, right? 47% say the cost is worth it only if you don't have to take out loans, right? So if you don't have to go into debt, okay, half of the respondents said that seems like a decent deal. Okay. Another sort of set of statistics. So in 2024, last year, after years of decline, American confidence in higher education maybe hit rock bottom. It peaked up a little bit this year. No idea why, but it may dip again, right? But 2024, 36% of Americans said that they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education as an institution in American life. Okay. So basically 2/3 of Americans have little to no confidence in higher education as an institution in American life. Now, higher education is not alone. You may read similar statistics about all sorts of institutions in American life not doing well right now. But higher education, which tended to have just a decade ago much higher rankings in these kinds of surveys, down to 36%, up a little bit in 2025. Okay. Here's one last sort of data point in the attitudes bucket. More than 1/3 of all graduates now say that their degree was a, quote unquote, this is the phrasing of the question, a waste of money. This frustration was especially pronounced among Gen Z, the current generation now in college and just out of college, with 51% expressing remorse. And 51% expressing remorse, apparently, at the cost of what they have paid to go to college and the value of their degree, compared to 41% of millennials and just 20% of baby boomers. Now, again, as you're thinking through, especially if you're a little bit older, you know the history, you know all the relevant factors, where the recession hit, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of factors are contributing to this. All right? But this is the state of play right now in terms of attitudes. Now, I don't have any specific polling data to share with you, but you also may likely have heard that for political reasons, both on the left and the right, people are not happy with the university as it now stands, with the college experience. And you may even know that there are some, Peter Thiel, very notably, an entrepreneur, who is actually giving scholarships to very sharp students to drop out of college and just go into the labor force. Just go do the work. Now, not all, of course, but the very bright computer scientists, maybe, that Peter Thiel's interested in, he'll pay you to just get out of college. Let's just go do the work. Okay. Demographics. This is the next bucket. So, by the latest estimates, for obvious reasons, these estimates will not change. By the latest estimates, 2025 will be this year, that the number of high school graduates peak. Right? The reason that matters is that high school graduates are the pool from which university students derive, right? So if you have declining numbers of high school graduates, you by necessity will have a smaller pool of potential college students, right, university students. That for many years now, this has been a point of interest in journalism that covers higher ed. So inside Chronicle Higher Education or inside higher ed, we'll talk about the demographic cliff. Now there are some that say maybe it's not quite a cliff, but it is definitely a long, rolling, steeping decline of people who are just available to come in and fill seats at colleges. The reason that this is the case is because beginning in 2007, again, you can plug in kind of the historical, social, political, economic context, birth rates began to decline. Now, they had already declined. If you look at the graph historically, it's a big decline already, that kind of stabilized, and then we get another sort of plunge. And as many people are fond of noting, you can manufacture a lot of things, but you cannot manufacture 18-year-olds today, right? You had to get going on that a while ago, right? So there will be no more new 18-year-olds than what presently exists next year, the year after, etc. Okay? So researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia, they unveiled, now, so why do I mention that? Because the financial model of most universities and colleges sort of depends that you have people in seats, right? That you have growing enrollment, right, to provide for. There are many ways that universities earn the revenue that they require, but certainly enrollment is a common part of that. So declining enrollment ultimately translates into declining revenue. Okay, so that's the connector to this next point. Researchers with the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia unveiled a new model that can predict college closures and the most at-risk institutions with a relatively high degree of accuracy, according to a recently released paper. The team forecasts that in a worst-case scenario for the higher ed sector, an abrupt 15% decline in overall enrollment, which sort of tracks with the demographic picture, from a 2019 baseline, that given those facts, this model projects that as many as 80 additional colleges could close each year. All right, so 80 colleges across the United States closing each year. And that would more than double the average annual closure rate today, which I would submit to you is still then actually pretty high. Okay, a brief word about the technological elements of the landscape. Right? So in that same, sort of adjacent to that same bucket about attitudes, right, put that sort of in that category. The spread of artificial intelligence into all parts of education and the workplace has made college graduates question their degree even more. This is a little subnote in the same study earlier that I cited about Gen Zers. So some 30% feeling that AI has outright made their degree irrelevant. That AI has made their degree irrelevant. That's overall, 30% overall. A number that jumps to 45% among Gen Zers. Right? So maybe even in college, maybe some of you, I don't know, you can tell me later, thinking, given what I see about the advent of AI in school throughout various aspects of the labor force, my degree is worthless. Now, that's worth questioning, right? I would love to know, what did you think your degree was going to give you to begin with, right? There are all sorts of assumptions baked into that, but just kind of giving you the raw numbers, okay? About attitudes, however justified they may or may not be. Okay, and so, aside from numbers, I would submit that whatever else you make of the relative promises and perils of AI, which is a wonderful conversation to have, it does seem relatively clear to me, I should say, that the introduction of generative AI has radically altered the university experience, which of course should come as no surprise. So I'm going to give you my favorite Neil Postman quote. There are so many great. I was glad Jay hats off Neil Postman. Great. That is a great book, by the way, Technopoly. So from Technopoly, Neil Postman, with what I take to be a kind of irrefutable logic, says the following: surrounding every technology are institutions whose organization, not to mention their very reason for being, reflects the worldview promoted by that technology. When you think of technology here, I think maybe one thing you can think of is the invention of writing, the invention of the printing press, the invention of television, electronic media broadly, right? And now the arrival of internet and close sequence artificial intelligence. Postman says, when an old technology is assaulted by a new one, institutions are threatened, right? So if you have institutions that grow up around the capacities and affordances of the new technology, to train you in the use of that technology, to take that technology for granted, when that technology is challenged, the institution is challenged, and Postman concludes the logic by saying, when institutions are threatened, a culture finds itself in crisis. Voila. Okay. Or QED, whatever you like. So, it should come as no surprise that the advent of a radically powerful technology of the word, also of the image, but of the word, will wreak havoc. I think whatever else you think the long-term trajectory is, right now, I would say, would wreak havoc in the way that many departments and disciplines are trying to carry out their work. Okay. All right, now, one last piece of the landscape, because I do want to, that's the general picture of higher education. Christian colleges specifically. Right? So I'm a graduate of Christian college. I am a graduate of Christian college that no longer exists. I do sometimes joke, it was the late, not so great Clearwater Christian College, right on the causeway between Tampa and Clearwater. It closed in 2013, and it is one of many such institutions that have shuttered their doors. Right? So if you think about the demographic cliff that I described, it just applies across the board. There's another interesting sort of statistical quasi-demographic development here, which has to do with the decline of the religiously affiliated. Right? The decline of the religiously affiliated. Now, I want to say that there are some indications that maybe that those numbers have plateaued. Or if you've read about this because some major outlet publishes some report on a Pew study or something like that, you know that the trend lines have been declining Christian, declining number of people identifying as Christian, rising number of Christians, of individuals identifying as what in the literature sometimes are called nuns. Right? Somebody at some point in this thing, I think, referred to that. So nuns is no religious affiliation. Okay? So while it appears that the decline of those demographic numbers is bad enough for the overall university college population, for Christian colleges in particular, when you combine it with the decline in those who are religiously affiliated, which maybe is sort of bottoming out, that's not a good picture. Right? That's a kind of perfect demographic storm facing Christian institutions. And one statistic on this that I've used in a couple of occasions, and I'll share with you, is that while the Christian education market only makes up 15% of the overall higher ed market in the United States, so Christian colleges, universities account for about 15% of the total picture. Those schools, Christian colleges and universities, have made up nearly 50% of recent closures. And in 2023, for example, Christian colleges accounted for 3/4 of the most prominent, so not just 50, 75% of the most prominent closures among institutions of higher education in the United States. Now, as a little side note, there is one sort of notable exception. So at the smallest sort of segment, right? These Christian colleges range from the large ones, I think Wheaton, Belmont, Biola. Some are thriving, very few, but some are very small. I counted 800 people at my college at its high water mark. So, but at that level and below, there are some Christian colleges that appear to be thriving. So not just some of the large, well-established endowments, but interestingly, those that are leaning into their distinct theological identities. Right? So, for example, a small little Catholic college in Steubenville, where they celebrate Mass thrice daily, and where students line up to receive confession each day, and they wear their Catholic identity very decisively and proudly. Little schools like that, there's a slight little uptick in enrollment, which I think is an interesting data point in all of this, right? But by and large, these institutions are in jeopardy. So that does prompt me to ask a question about what does the future of Christian learning look like, right? Where we have depended to some degree on these institutions. The church has, right? The college is sort of a product of the denominational structure of the United States, right? And so denominations have their colleges. Some of these colleges now are not denominationally affiliated. Some are independent. but there was some dependence upon the college as a place where Christian formation was going to happen. Christian education, in the broadest sense, was going to happen. And if those institutions that the church, broadly speaking, cultivated, at least here in this country, in order to be sites of Christian formation, if they are failing, what comes next? That's the question. So to sum up this part, the outlook for smaller, less prestigious colleges and universities, like I think Harvard's going to be fine, right? UF is going to be fine, right? UF is probably going to grow because those that are going to make their way to university colleges will, for various reasons, probably not choose the teetering small college that's out of the way. And they're going to come to the big, the prosperous university. UF will have to decide what it's going to do with, limits and caps enrollments. But this is the largest freshman class in UF history this year, which is a little shocking given everything that's been going on. But nonetheless, they came, right? Now, so it's challenging for small, less prestigious college and university. For similar Christian institutions, it's downright bleak. Okay, and then, yes, I think regional powerhouses, schools like UF, they're going to do just fine. So then, let me reframe. Well, actually, let me add this. I say UF is going to do fine, right? I mean that in the sense that, like, nobody's shutting the doors, nobody's turning the lights out. Okay? Whether UF is going to deliver on our highest aspirations for the promise of education or not, that's a different question, right? And I would say it's not altogether clear that they will, in fact, provide a compelling educational experience. And in part, it could go off for a long while on this, but Jay did it for me yesterday, right? So simply import everything Jay told you about the medical profession, just change the terminology, put it right into these large university settings, right? If you weren't here yesterday for Jay's talk, this may make a little less sense, but Jay identified what he called the medical accreditation government industrial complex, the Magic Kingdom. Okay, wonderful little, for lots of reasons. So the Magic Kingdom, medical accreditation government industrial complex, which has led to a kind of dehumanizing of the medical profession. You can speak not just of the medical system, you can speak of the educational system. So even though these colleges will remain maybe fiscally healthy, right, or sustainable, whether in fact they are delivering on the promise of a true humane education, that's a separate question altogether. Okay. So let me go back to my two questions and rephrase them just a little bit in light of what I've just discussed, right? Can study centers, first question, can study centers fill the void created by the decline of the Christian college? Can study centers fill the void created by the decline of the Christian college? One of the beautiful things about the Christian tradition is that we've been at this for a couple of millennia. And so, love the comments about history, right? There is precedent, right? We all tend to think our age is the worst age, our time is the worst time. Like, we don't have Vikings storming our monasteries and killing our monks, right? It could be worse. So there is precedent to see that the church is actually pretty good, contrary to the stereotype. The church is actually pretty good at institutional innovation, right? You don't survive 2,000 years without being pretty good at institutional innovation. Right? And even as you think of the education space, right, the education landscape, Christians have been innovating in education from the beginning, right? I don't know if you've ever read about the catechetical process for early Christians to join a church. It was more robust than getting a 4-year degree at UF. This is before they would baptize you. So there were cathedral schools, there were schools attached to monasteries. The university itself is an innovation, derives out of Christian culture. The Christian college is another iteration of that. You can think of missionary societies. You can think of all sorts of schools for the poor and the disenfranchised. You can think of the ways in which the church deployed print as a means to educate and propagate its message, et cetera, et cetera. The church is actually interestingly innovative. Right? So what that means is that we just have to ask the question again, well, what is needed now for this moment? right? Not to panic that we're losing this particular institution that has maybe held us over relatively well for several generations. But how do we now innovate, institutionally innovate, to meet the demands of this moment, right? And to do what Christians have always been interested in doing, which is to intellectually form their people, right? And morally and spiritually form their people. And so my question, all that said, is, our study center is an answer to that question. Spoiler alert, yes, right? Obviously, right? I'm not asking that question because I'm going to say, no, actually, I don't think we're going to be able to do this. So long, goodbye. I think so, and I think this is actually a very hopeful moment, right? And a very exciting moment as well. And then the second question is related to the university proper. Can study centers productively fill the void of learning created by the transformations that have reshaped secular universities? Yeah. There's a lot baked into that. You can maybe debate and disagree about how bad it's gotten. But it's not great. Any of you ever watch Mad Men? One of my favorite memes come out of shows is this little scene where the character says, he's asked, how's your day going? He just got fired. He says, not great, Bob. And this is a recurring meme. So how's the state of learning in higher? Not great, Bob. I think that's my take. What can study centers do about that? Right? Do we have a role to play in that? All right. So a modest yes to both questions. And I think that actually these things can happen simultaneously, right? Study centers respond to both of these needs simultaneously. Okay. On the first question, what are we doing about Christian education, Christian learning? Because part of what study centers are probably not going to do is give you a 4-year degree at the end of it, right? And maybe that's not even the point, right? That's not, Christian education is not synonymous with getting a piece of paper that says you earned a bachelor's degree and it had 120 credit hours. We're talking about something, we maybe need to think more broadly. Okay? So this is from a book, I'm going to read you a short paragraph from a book by Perry Glanzer, Theodore Cockle, and Jessica Martin, Christian scholars of education. One of them, I think, is a psychologist. So they wrote a book called Christian Higher Education, A Survey. And this is in 2023, so very recent. And the idea was to just give, I think, prospective parents, students, just a survey of the state of Christian higher education. They trace various denominational traditions in their colleges, universities, etc. But they have a chapter at the end of their book called A New Vision for U.S. Christian Higher Education, Christian Centers of Christian Thought. That's us. So they use the term, not study centers, but Centers of Christian Thought. And they use that to both include Protestant non-denominational variations, which usually use study center as the name, but also institutes of Catholic learning. And they're very similar kinds of institutions. We have one, in fact, in the Consortium of Christian Study Centers. Right? So these centers, what they call Centers of Christian Thought, i.e. study centers, they propose as a new vision for U.S. Christian higher education. In fact, what they have seen is we can't write a book about Christian higher education unless we take into account these new institutions. Here's one little summation of their proposal. So a recent study found that nearly 60% of U.S. freshmen who identified as Christian, both Protestant and Catholic, chose to attend public or non-sectarian colleges or universities. Now, let's just sit on that for a moment, right? So even if we're thinking of a time where there's a robust array of Christian colleges available, the majority of Christians were not going to go to them. Right? The majority of Christians were not going to pass through the doors of Christian college. In fact, I don't even want to, I could raise a hand. Some of you went to Christian college, I suspect. I don't know, let's just do it, right? I've said it. Christian college graduates? Okay. Count. No, look, this is even worse than I thought. Not worse, right? But it is more telling, right? More telling that in this group of very thoughtful Christians who have done very well for themselves, right? Who I would think are like cream of the crop. Credit to you, right? 3, 4 out of a group, maybe 100 at least gathered here, maybe a little less than 100. But so the majority of Christians were not even going to go to these institutions, for better or for worse. They're going to state universities, right? And so in one respect, we would say, even if they were healthy, there's a massive opportunity that's had been maybe missed, right? Okay. Here's what they say. That's statistic. So such a decision might have once meant foregoing a distinctly Christian approach to higher education. So you're making a choice. We're going to go to the state college. We're going to go to the state university. We're going to go to the Ivy League, whatever. And the author said maybe there was a time that decision might have meant foregoing a distinctly Christian approach to higher education. But the rise and growth of a new type of center, independent of but adjacent to pluralistic institutions, means that these students can now find a Christian education whether they attend a Christian college or not. Yes and amen. Right? Yes and amen. So I had a conversation with somebody here at the center a little while ago. They were a parent. They were visiting their student. Their son, spent 2 years at Wheaton because they were torn. They wanted to get Christian college thing, right? They cared about learning in a Christian context, so they went to Wheaton. But after 2 years, decided the costs for their future, this is not, no shade on Wheaton, right? But they thought, I need to go to the state. So they came to UF, right, for what UF offered them specifically in their career path. Right? And so in my head, I'm thinking, why not both? Right? Why not both? If study centers can rise to the moment, we don't have to force that choice on students, right? So my hope, my aspiration is that the Christian student who comes to UF is not foregoing a distinctly Christian education. They're receiving it by other means. Right? And that's why we're here. Okay. The second, right, so this on the second question, so what I would propose here is that at their best, Christian study centers, through its students and through the connected faculty, right, the faculty that are connected to the study center, can foster and promote Christian intellectual life in such a way that it feeds back into and nourishes the life of the university. This is not a magic, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to radically, overnight transform the institution. But sometimes slow growth is slow, right? But it's something, it's a real thing, and I think it's a substantive thing, right? To have a place where there's a vision of education that is vital, that is humane, that is alive, and have people form in that in such a way that they go back into the university and bring that there, and there's a kind of very helpful cycle that happens that promotes the health of the university, because we care about the university. Okay, now one way to think about this is to imagine Christian study centers. Now you can, I don't know, some of you might, I don't know, I'm not sure how this is going to land. One way of thinking about this is to imagine Christian study centers as theology departments in exile. As theology departments in exile. Yeah. So you've heard this before, right? That unity in the university, right? Much of it derived from the fact that the unity was provided by theology, Queen of the Sciences, which is like an archaic phrase. You even feel dumb for saying it, right? But you shouldn't, right? Theology organized the life of the university. It provided the metaphysical context in which you could say, yeah, all these disciplines actually together give us a picture of the world as a whole, right? Now we don't experience the university, we experience the multiversity. And the purposes are no longer the high purposes of a Christian calling or view of the world, understanding of the world, promotion of knowledge and wisdom. There are other purposes, which I think we can all name. So to imagine Christian study centers as theology departments in exile, but also maybe the one way I would correct this a little bit is not the theology department, that promotes maybe the view that we're just teaching theology. Come get your systematics classes in, right? I don't think that's the whole of it. I think that maybe is part of it. We have just begun offering, incidentally, this is a little commercial, yes, I realize, but we just began offering short courses, so 5-week courses in 3 categories: theology, history of Christianity, and applied theology, which basically is a way of saying where we think theologically about something. Right? And so we had a wonderful short course on the doctrines of Trinity in the early church. We are about to have a course on the history of early Christianity, actually taught by the same person who's teaching the class at UF, giving us, Zachary West, giving us an abridged version of that. And I think the reason for offering this is to kind of lean into this idea that, well, the question that keeps haunting me is, if not here, where? Right? If not with us, where is this going to happen? Right? Where will the student get an introduction to the doctrine of the Trinity in the early church? Where are they going to learn the history of their tradition? Right? So this is what we're trying to build out. But so then I say all that to then go back to this idea, not theology proper necessarily, although yes, a little bit of that, but maybe departments of theological imagination. Because what we want to promote is not the idea that every one of us needs to be a professional theologian, but that every one of us ought to think theologically about every aspect of our lives. And that's what we want to promote. That's not going to happen necessarily from within the university. Even the Christian professors in the university are limited in how they can begin to bring expression to that. Limited in two ways, I should say. Limited in the ways you probably thought of when I said that, which is institutionally there are guardrails against that kind of advocacy. But limited also in the sense that they may not have received the training to do it. And so part of the work of the study center is to be a place where not just the student at the early stages of professionalization learns to think theologically about their work, but that the Christian professor who passed through years of educational professionalization in secular institutions can now learn to bring together all of that expertise with their theological convictions about the world, something that at no place have they been encouraged to do. And so there is a little bit of maybe work to remediate the gaps that have been created, but then to prevent those gaps from forming in the next generation of students right at the outset, so that they think with integrity about themselves as whole persons, so that they're not bracketing their faith from their work or their intellectual life, and neither are they bracketing their study and their research and their discipline specifically from the claims of Christianity about the nature of the people, about the world and the people in it. So there are three things that I think in this context, ways of thinking about how study centers can be sort of departments of theological imagination in exile, what they offer. And I'll pick up the pace slightly. One, a vision for the unity of truth, goodness, and beauty. Right? That the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty is one thing. We seek knowledge, we're seeking these things. And that there is a unity, a fundamental unity of truth, goodness, and beauty in the being of God, and it is reflected in creation. Right? So again, so much of what this theology department of exile offers is just an integration of what has been broken apart, both within the fragment itself and the fragmented curricular program. So the unity of truth, goodness, and beauty, we believe these things are real because we believe that they describe the nature of God in our experience. Second, the integrity of the human experience, that your intellectual, moral, embodied, and spiritual elements of the self belong together. They don't need to be held apart, right? They can be brought together, and you can experience as a person the kind of wholeness you were made for by bringing your study and your devotion, your faith, and your reason together in your embodied experience of the world. And thirdly, we supply a way of thinking about the aim and purpose of education. Right? The aim, what is it you're after here? Because the default answer to that question, I don't think I'm being overly cynical in saying that, is to get a piece of paper that gives you a pass into a high-paying adult job, right? Which is no small thing. Which is no small thing. But I think historically the promise of education has been grander and more profound. But that's been lost sight of. It's been lost sight of because there's no vision of human flourishing that can bring that to bear upon the life of the university. And so that is part of what we can supply. Now, I will kind of leave the last segment, right, of the talk here. Babies are welcome, by the way. So the paradigm, the metaphor, everybody I work with now will roll their eyes all the way back to their heads, right? The metaphor that's captured my imagination, long before there was a book called Benedict Concoction, I should say, is the monastic metaphor, right? Because what I see in especially the early monastic movement, is the kind of institutional innovation that I described earlier. So, in late antiquity, in a period that probably felt a bit more chaotic than ours, although, clock's not run out on our age yet. In a time where older traditions were being jeopardized, right, where social structures, the structures of organized society were crumbling, and there was a question about what is civilization? What are we going to do? these monasteries emerged, and they emerged to do many things. All right, the way I'm going to talk about it for our purpose here is three things. They emerged to preserve. Some things were at risk, right? Some things were knowledge was at risk of being lost. Monasteries preserved that knowledge. Right? So there's an act of keeping something before us. They formed. Right? The mass communities were centers of spiritual, moral, intellectual formation. Right? They developed mechanisms, they developed programs, we might say today, to form the people that were a part, that were members of their community. And they were also, contrary perhaps to the prejudices of certain Protestant ways of thinking about monasteries, they were sites of mission. Right? They were not isolated from society for the sake of being isolated from society. They were places of preservation and formation that then became seeds of the renewal and restoration and flowering of culture across Europe. Unfortunately, there are a lot of, as I think Josh very politely hinted to, ways of taking that story that I would not want to associate a study center with, but I think there are legitimate ways of saying we're seeking to honor and glorify God. We have something to offer the world. And if we take seriously what we believe about God and the nature of the human person, it's going to have consequences for culture, for art, for the way we organize our social lives, etc. Okay. So, preserving, forming, and mission. It bothered me immensely that I couldn't get a gerund at the end there. What do we preserve? I had a wonderful conversation with Mike yesterday. By the way, Mike Nardella is our new board president. Jay's walking out. It was very apropos. As I say this, Jay has turned his back and is walking out. Jay served as our board president for 24 years. Mike Nardella is our new board president, and I am so delighted to be serving under his leadership. So Mike and I had a wonderful conversation yesterday. And Mike was reminiscing about his experience as a classics major at UF. And part of what we talked about is how there's a kind of real magic. Part of what I want to say, I see this was in my head this morning as I'm thinking about Jay's talk. The thing is, we have a deeper magic, right? To answer the magic kingdom, in Jay's terminology, right, we have a deeper magic. Right? And it's this magic that even Mike was describing would happen even with the secular pagan professors, where they were so in love with the thing that they were teaching, and so captivated by its beauty, that they would weep. They would weep. We came to the sad conclusion, as Mike kind of scrolled and said, all the ones that cried over their text are no longer here. Right? All the weirdos are gone. All the careerists have remained. Okay? So, but we need to face reality. Right? So what can we do? Can we be a place where that magic happens? I thought recently about how that moment, maybe because at the wonderful Jess Ray concert last night, she has a song where she kind of reflects on the disciples meeting Jesus on the road to Emmaus. You know, were our hearts not on fire? Right? Did we not feel our hearts burn within us? And there's a way of looking at what Jesus did and just say, this was just a humanities seminar. He opened the text and interpreted it with them and showed them the truth of it. Now, of course, he also broke bread with them. His hospitality. Right? But there's a sense in which you can simply, now, you might say, no, that's not really it. It's Jesus' presence. It's resurrected. Yes, and. Okay? He also explicated a text to them. He showed them how he was present throughout the Old Testament. Right? There is a kind of, and what I want to say is that this isn't too sacrilegious, is that when you get that magic moment in the classroom, it is almost like a kind of sacrament of the larger magic that we partake in, because what you're participating in is truth. And all truth is God's truth. And all beauty derives from God's beauty. And so when you get a taste of it, whether you recognize it or not, you're experiencing something true, the deep magic of reality. And it could even happen in a classroom, if we would let it. Right? So can we keep that magic alive? Can the study center be a place where not just great Christian texts? I remember Richard one time, long before I came up here to talk to you, because I was trying to make my way through grad school. I don't know if you remember this. But I think you made this comment about how Christians are the only ones reading Nietzsche anymore. As ironic as that is, right? Can we keep a mode of learning alive? Monasteries struggle to preserve texts. We have an abundance of text. We have so much text we don't know what to do with it, except set our machines on it to give us outputs, right? But we are in danger of losing modes of learning, ways of being in the world. This is what we must preserve. The fact that a group of people will come together with a cup of coffee across the table to discuss a challenging text that will make them think, that will awaken in them their intellect, their aesthetic sensibilities, will blow them away, will bring tears to their eyes, make them fully human, remind them what it is to be fully human as creatures created. That is a gift. And we need to preserve that. Right? And I think Christian Study Centers can do that. Formation. So I'm going to read you, I'm going to summarize. I'm going to summarize for you a little bit. My great teacher at Bonwich. So, like many prophetic voices, he saw many of these things happening way ahead of others. And one of the things, interestingly, that it was pointed to is that the trajectory we're sort of on now, it actually happened at the very founding of the universities. Because for Illich, there was a monastic mode of reading and learning, and then what emerged in the university is what he called a scholastic mode of, and it's very right brain, left brain, actually. Scholastic mode of reading and learning. And so already at the foundations of the university in the 1200s, there is a kind of rupture in the human person, where spiritual formation goes one way, intellectual formation goes the other. And Illich is looking at a situation in the 1990s and saying, maybe what we now need to do is bring those right back together. Yes and amen. Okay. So that we see intellectual formation being not something distinct from our spiritual and moral formation, but part and parcel of our moral and spiritual formation. He has this great, I will read this portion of it. He says, it appears to me that we cannot neglect, this is going to be dense, so just hang on with me, but I'll break it down. It appears to me that we cannot neglect the disciplined recovery and asceticism of a sensual praxis, right? By which he means we can't neglect an asceticism of like our embodied sense experience of the world, right? In a society of what he then calls technogenic mirages. This is pre-AI instead. This reclaiming of the senses, this desire to obey experience, the chaste look that the rule of St. Benedict opposes to the lust of the eyes seems to me to be the fundamental condition for renouncing that technique which sets up a definitive obstacle to friendship. Right? Part of what Illich is foreseeing is that if we lock ourselves in to virtual realities, we will lose touch with the very medium, the body that God gave us to make our way in the world and to build our relationships with one another. And part of what learning now consists of, if you ask me to describe what the Christian liberal arts are in the 21st century, it is not just grammar, logic, rhetoric, plus the quadrivium. It is also the spiritual practice that was left aside when the university split from the monastery. The spiritual practice of training your attention. What more profound need do any of us need to learn to be fully human in this world than to discipline our attention in the age of distraction in which we live? That's a spiritual practice. It needs to be part of our learning. Right? And so can the Study Center be a place where these kind of spiritual practices don't live somewhere else and apart from, or maybe don't happen at all, but are integrated directly into our desire to teach the truth of the faith, to teach Christians to think Christianly? That's going to require not only a renovation of the mind, but of the heart and of the body as well. The last thing I'll say then is mission, right? Because I don't think we do this for ourselves. Like Christians, we will always do it for the glory of God and for the love of the world, properly speaking. And so if we do that for students and for faculty members, we simultaneously do it for the university. Right? This becomes the site of preparation for the mission, right? To be sent back out to the university and beyond, right? Our desire is that the vision, the Christian vision of life, learning, and hospitality that we seek to have our students encounter and be trained in, that they then carry that into whatever work they do at the university and beyond, but certainly at the university. So our journey, a lovely metaphor that I'm also very fond of, is that our spiritual life is a journey, and our intellectual life is a journey. We can frame this in lots of different ways, but it is a journey. And very literally for the university, right? Because most students will go on. This is a way station. They are literally on a journey. They will come and move into Gainesville. They will spend 4 years on, and they will go on somewhere else, right? So we're on a journey. And on that journey, the university can sometimes feel, particularly when we're thinking of the intellectual dimensions of our journey, like a kind of wilderness. And so what we do is what monasteries also did, which is to welcome the traveler, right? To open the door of hospitality, to even serve as a kind of hospital for the soul. We welcome the weary traveler, we feed them, we offer them friendship. And I think at the end of it all, I think what we offer is a vision of friendship. Friendship with God, friendship with the world, friendship and a harmonizing of the self so we can properly be said to be friends of our own selves. We offer them friendship, and then we send them back on their way, that they may take these gifts and spread them far and wide by their presence, by their own engagement. So I will close on that note of friendship with this wonderful passage from a letter that Hugh of St. Victor, a 13th century theologian, wrote to a fellow brother at a different chapter of his monastic community that he had visited. Here's what Hugh of St. Victor says. To my dear brother Randolph, from Hugh, a sinner. Charity, love, charity never ends. When I first heard this, I knew it was true. But now, dearest brother, I have the personal experience of fully knowing that charity never ends. For I was a foreigner and met you in a strange land. But the land was not really strange, for I found friends there. I don't know whether I first made a friend or was made one, but I found charity there and I loved it, and could not tire of it, for it was sweet to me and it filled my heart with it. And I was sad that my heart could hold so little. I could not take in all that there was, but I took as much as I could and weighed down with this precious gift. I did not feel any burden because my full heart sustained me. And now, having made a long journey, I find my heart still warmed, and none of the gift has been lost, for charity never ends. I hope that someday, somebody who comes across a study center will be able to pen these very sentiments. Right? That they found, in their experience with us, something that did make their heart burn. Yes, for the reality of Christ, and yes, for what is true, good, and beautiful in the world. That they found hospitality that invited a kind of friendship that is an antidote to the loneliness and isolation of the age. That they found friendship, deeper friendship with God, friends that would sustain them throughout their own lives, and that they would remember us fondly as a place where they learned that the gifts of God never end. Never end. Thank you all very much.